Okay, hello, everybody. We are talking in your Marx chapter. You did tons of stuff, and we're gonna get to a lot of it in the coming weeks, going into more depth on it on the coming weeks. And your forum post actually does deal with his environmental argument, because I know some of your environmental studies majors or science majors, and I thought you might find that especially interesting. So I wanted to make sure you had a chance to talk about that. So we're going to do in the forum. But I can only really focus, I can't focus on everything in my lecture, so I'm going to pick up some themes that he goes in as the rest of the semester progresses. But this week, as promised, I've been talking about this for numerous weeks that we're going to be doing this. We're going to be talking about Japan. And Mira, you've been to Japan. Mira and I have had Japan 3 days. Yeah, we lived in Shanghai in the fall of 2017, from like August, summer, and sort of into the winter too, summer to January. August to January in 2017, and we took a trip to Japan as well. And tell everyone what you thought of Japan.
I loved it.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, she did. It's a cool country to visit. I actually also taught there for a year, so I lived there for a year as well. But that's not what you're concerned with. You're concerned with there's a specific question that's interesting, and I've referred to it numerous times. And that is your potential exam question for the final, or your final exam question. And this is probably will almost certainly be on the exam. Why is Japan the only non-Western power to become a first world developed country? So I've talked about that. I've said we're going to go over that and have a lecture, and so that now is the time we're doing this. What were the costs involved in this transformation, and why is it important to understand this? And there's a dour piece. So in addition to the lecture, that I'm talking about, in addition to the Marx piece, there's also a piece about John Dower. John Dower, to let you know, is one of the most important historians of Japan. It's certainly probably the most important American historian of Japan. Especially he focuses on Japan in the post-war, 1930s kind of post-war era. In the actual war, World War II, and the post-war era, and a little bit the pre-war era as well. And what's very interesting is you get to see, what I gave you is a piece where he's using his expertise to weigh in on a historical debate that was happening in 2002 and 2003. And he wrote like probably a half dozen, maybe more than that, pieces on this. Because people were talking about with Iraq, the Iraq War, how the occupation in Iraq, people were predicting, or foreign policies the Bush administration was predicting, that it was going to be just like Iraq. And that was really, Iraq was going to be just like Japan. That Japan worked really well, it was a good occupation, and now Japan and the United States are friends, and Japan has been such a staunch ally, and Iraq's going to be the same way. And since he'd actually studied this occupation, he's like, no, Iraq and Japan are nothing alike, and he explains why that is. So there are some questions. Your short answer question is about that. So there are several really good questions on that, and then that would be your response paper if you choose to do a response paper this week as well. So it's an interesting thing, and it ties nicely because next week we're going to be doing the Middle East. So it kind of ties these two things together. When in high school you tend to hear things like, okay, this is just like one fact about this place, but as college historian, I think it's more important to kind of understand why these debates are important, because you guys are adults now, and you guys are watching these things and being citizens. So you get to kind of see this as citizens. So. Yeah. Anyway, so that's why I'm kind of giving you not just like, here's the effects of Japan, but here are how people discuss this. Here are how things happen in the public world. Here are how these debates happen. So Japan before opening. 1540s. The Japanese were interested in Portuguese technology. The Portuguese were the first some of the first European ocean sailors, and they went to Africa, and they also went to Japan. Now the question is, why were they interested when China was not? Well, I'm going to talk more about this later on, but basically the Japanese as a culture. So they're a very proud culture, an island culture, an island nation, and they've always been in the shadow of the most powerful country in the world. Not always, not from the 19th century. Japan became more powerful. We're going to talk about that more later. But for most of its history, it was in the shadow of this incredibly powerful country. And so they used a lot from Japan, like a lot of the same Japanese has its own language, its own grammar. They're not Chinese and Japanese are very different languages. Like a Japanese person can't understand Chinese. A Chinese person can understand Japanese unless they've studied it, of course. If they've studied the language, they could, but they can't. Yes, I know, and you've actually studied. Yeah, and Mira has studied Chinese.
And I don't know Japanese.
Yeah, you don't know Japanese except for a few words. But the characters are very similar, but the grammar is all the same. So the Japanese had always been used to like being able to adapt things and make them their own. That's kind of almost a hallmark. If there's one big hallmark of the Japanese culture, that would probably be it. And so they were interested in this. Like tempura, for example, which is a famous Japanese food. It's like vegetables and sometimes shrimp and sometimes chicken. Put in this kind of batter and eaten. It's a traditional Japanese food, but it's actually influenced by the Portuguese. So they were all sorts of kind of influenced by this. They brought in Christianity, which at first a lot of Japanese converted to Christianity, but then Christianity became associated with rebellion because there was a big rebellion against some of the landowners, and a lot of the people who were leaders were involved in it were Christian. I'm not going to give you the big details for that, but that's just what you need to know. So Christianity was banished in 1587. Japanese Christians had to renounce their religion or die. They didn't play around, and most of them did. There were a few martyrs, but not all that many. So after 1639, the Japanese had contact with foreigners through only one city, and that's Nagasaki, with the non-missionary Dutch. Only the Dutch were allowed to come, because the Dutch didn't fool around with missionaries. They're like, okay, we only want to trade. Like other people had this idea. It's like, okay, we don't just want to trade. We want to civilize you. We want to bring your wonderful culture to you. We want to, and then there's the missionary impulse. We want to introduce Christianity. The Dutch were like, nope, we don't care about any of that. We just want money. That's it. So so they only agreed to trade with the Dutch, and that was through Nagasaki. And that actually did wind up to be a city with a fair number of Japanese Christians. And I'll talk about why that's kind of interesting later on. Okay, come and look at this picture. So Matthew Perry opened Japan. Do you think that's the right Matthew Perry? No, you look puzzled. See, one day, in about 10 years, all my students are going to be Mira's age. And unless Friends continues to be on Netflix, you're not going to get the humor in this. This is you haven't seen Friends, have you?
No.
But this is kind of a joke, because it's not this Matthew Perry. So people don't ever laugh uproariously, and I can't hear your reaction. It's just sort of a funny little thing that I put there. No, it's not that Matthew Perry. This is the guy, the Commander Matthew Perry, who just happened to have. There are probably many people who have the name Matthew Perry, but these two particularly famous ones do. So he's the American who opened Japan, 1853. He came to Japan. He said basically, if you don't let us in and you don't trade with us, and let us bring our missionaries, like not kill, because it's like a whole country and they didn't threaten to kill every single Japanese person in the country, because that would have been, I shouldn't even laugh at that, but that would be pretty horrific. But they said, we'll attack you and we'll make you do it. So like enough people would have died. So there was the threat of violence. They saw Japan primarily as a fueling station, especially on the way to the Philippines. They didn't see Japan as that valuable in its own right. One big thing, which actually John Dower talks about, which actually might have helped Japan's occupation go better, that argument that he makes, is that Japan was very resource poor. This became one big reason why they were interested in imperialism. But Japan it's an island nation. It has very, very few resources. So they weren't that interested in colonizing them. So basically, what did Japan have to offer Europe and the U.S.? Not very much. So about a year goes by. He comes and he says, I'm going to come back in a year. He doesn't actually force them to make the decision now, which is smart. He says, okay, I'm going to come back in a year and give you time to think about this, whether you want to go to war with us or not. And so they gather all the samurai who were the powerful people at the time, and they send messages to them. And some of them were like, yeah, we should do it. Some were like, no, of course we shouldn't. And all like, I don't know. Well, the majority were like, it was a hard thing and unexpected for Japan. But in the end, they decided to open. They opened voluntarily. Now, here's the other question. Why was Japan's voluntarily opening important? Because they weren't weakened by war. They decided themselves, and so to some extent, more than anybody else, they dealt with the West to some extent on their own terms. Not totally, because they had unequal treaties. So when they came back, even though they're voluntarily owning, it's like, okay, yeah, the treaties were still unequal, and they were still in favor of the West. A big reason why they decided to do it was because why they decided to open was they'd seen what happened to China. Remember, this is 1853. The opening war was 1839 to 1841. So just like like about a decade ago. And so they said, wow, that actually didn't go well for China at all. So, and if China, who's so much bigger than us, at the time they were so much bigger and more powerful, we're not going to be able to fight them. So it's better just to open and do this on our own terms. And they did. So here are Matthew Perry's ships. These are very famous in Japan. They're the big black ships that came. All Japanese people know about these ships. Here's another picture of them. Here's the big black ship, and here's the Japanese going out to meet them. And you see they didn't possess huge ships like that at the time. So this is kind of this is a very famous picture. What do you think? You like it?
A picture?
Yeah.
It's not a picture.
It's a picture, yeah. Okay, so then we have, so I'm giving you a very broad overview because we're going to World War II in this, so I have to, or after really the Cold War, so I have to go through a lot, so I can't. So through this time you have the Meiji Restoration from 1868 to 1912. And this was a time when Japan became strong. Now you see this picture?
Yeah.
See, these are traditional Japanese, but this is a piano, so this is like a Western instrument, and this became really popular in Japan. And there came a day, rich country, strong army. Feudalism was abolished. They started building railroads and telegraph lines hugely. They had more than China by the end of this period, and not more per capita than China, just more. And that's amazing. I mean, Japan is a few small islands, and China is a huge country. So the fact that they had more than these in China is amazing. Now the last part is really, really important. They used foreign experts. They learned from them. They fired them. The firing is really key. So they brought a lot of foreign experts in, and the Japanese learned from them. And they fired them nicely. I should say that no one is better than severing a relationship politely than the Japanese. I shouldn't say. I mean, I'm sort of stereotyping. Not individual Japanese, but as a culture. It's kind of a cultural trait.
Not like those shows where you're fired.
Yeah, not like not like that. Not like that. They would the contracts would end, and they would say, "Well, thank you so much for all you've done," and they'd give them a big banquet. And it's keep in touch. You're not working for us anymore. I mean, politely, goodbye. Nice to see you. And a lot of people were really startled because they expected to be there for like 30 years, and it would be like another 5 years. Okay, well, thank you. You've taught us so well that we learned so much. You know, we respect you. And they'd give them parting gifts, but it was very definite that they were out. Now,
thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Next, yeah, that's right. Not really next though, because it was what was next with the Japanese taking over themselves. Now the question is, why couldn't other people do this? And I always ask my classes. I'm not going to try to make you answer this, Mira, because it's a little bit of a question. But like, why couldn't they do this in Africa? Why couldn't they do this in India? Because in Africa and in India and other places, there were really smart people who learned really well. Just like the Japanese did. Really, really smart people who went to the Western schools. I talked about Africa last week, and they had missionary schools who had no problem learning this technical stuff. So why couldn't they do this? Why couldn't they learn from foreign experts and then fire them? Do you have any idea?
Oh.
Well, it's because they were colonies. Now, China wasn't a colony. I'll talk about China more later on. But they were colonies. They couldn't. They were taken over militarily. This is the huge difference. I cannot emphasize this enough. Japan was not a colony. Japan opened voluntarily. This is why this was so important. So they could, because of this, and because they didn't really have anything that other people wanted, because they were resource poor, that's another thing, that it was actually kind of, it sounds like a curse, but it's actually kind of a blessing in some ways. They didn't have that many resources, so that they weren't attractive as a colony to begin with. They were kind of seen more as a fueling station, so they were able to open voluntarily. They were able to really learn quickly, and then they could throw them out nicely, politely, but still still control things themselves. If you're a colony, you can't do that. You don't have the power to fire people. They're there, and they're there forever. Like, yeah, we don't think you've learned enough from us yet. Yeah, we think you still need our help. They still thought foreigners still thought the Japanese needed their help. They're like, yeah, no, we really don't, but thank you. So that's huge, okay? They weren't a colony, so they could fire people and they could start taking over. They could learn from the foreigners, and then they could start running themselves. This is hugely important. They were the only country to throw off unequal treaties. They became imperial power. They were known, this is actually really a kind of a sad part, and we're going to talk about the costs more, as the whites of Asia. People called them that. The German Nazis called them that, for example, when we get to the 1930s. But they also saw themselves that way, as being almost, because this is the sad part. They learned a lot of the technology. The inspiring kind of good, interesting part of the story is how quickly Japanese learned the technology. What Japanese, I think, are very justifiably proud of is learning the technology and being able to run their own country and make the country very modern very quickly. Unfortunately, they also learned this ideas of race. And the Japanese had a very conflicting idea of race. They understood that, like, racism, especially with Japanese immigrants in the United States, suffered from racism. So they saw the idea that Europeans were superior to the Japanese as being problematic. But to some extent, they embraced it, and they saw themselves as beings. They started to see themselves. They didn't initially do this, but starting to see themselves as being a superior race to other Asians. And they started using the same kind of logic, the same kind of racist logic. Marx mentions this in his book about the Japanese. So that's kind of a sad part of the story. And when we talk about cost and we talk about World War II, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So, Japanese as imperials. As I mentioned, Japan was an island, very resource poor, in a way that was kind of a blessing for them in some ways. And then John Dower will talk about how in the occupation after World War II it became a blessing again in some ways. But they didn't consider it a blessing at the time. They thought they needed more resources. And they also embraced ideologies of race and saw to see themselves as a superior race who should help and guide the other Asian countries. So they took over neighboring islands. The Sino-Japanese War in 1894-1895 gave Japan power in Taiwan and Korea. These are huge wars. The Sino-Japanese War, they went to war over Korea, basically. I'm not going to give you all the details about why they went to war. Just understand that the Chinese and Japanese went to war over influence in Korea. Who would influence Korea? Everyone thought the Chinese would win because they were so much bigger. They didn't. The Japanese won. This was a huge thing in China. I'm going to talk later on when I talk about China, what a huge idea this was in China. But it was also huge in Japan. And then they didn't officially take power in Korea until 1910, but it gave them more power in Korea. Korea became a Japanese colony in 1910. The Russo-Japanese War in 1905 over Manchuria. Manchuria didn't become an official Japanese colony until the 1930s. I'll talk more about that momentarily. But this was huge. This was the first time an Asian power had beaten a Western power in a direct war. Because remember, when the Chinese were superior, they weren't actually going to war with European countries. So this was a time, the Russians were the weakest of the Europeans, it's true, but it was still shocking. Because the Japanese really, people who really saw race or really embraced ideas of race and the idea that Anglo-Saxons or quote-unquote white people were superior to everybody else, the Japanese really made them uncomfortable, and they had to go through a lot of mental gymnastics to explain the Japanese, because the Japanese were modernizing so quickly. The new colonies provided Japan with food, raw materials, like more space for food, like places where they could grow food. Raw materials, foreign exchange, more prestige. They gave some education, but the top positions were for Japanese, just like the British were in India, and the British actually many African countries. They really modeled themselves after the British. It's ironic because one of the reasons the Japanese were able to modernize was they were able to fire people, and not they weren't a colony, but when they had their own colonies, they ran them very much like the British. And so even though they gave people some education, they never let Korea or Taiwan, they never let the Taiwanese or the Koreans. Later on, we're going to see the Indonesians. They never let them actually run anything. They said, "No, you're not ready. We need to civilize you. We're the civilized, smart people. We need to do that." So they use the same logic as the British did for their Indian and some of their African colonies. There, and that's a little bit sad. Yeah, it's a kind of irony here. So this is just a map that you can see Japanese expansion, and it gives you some years. And it gives you can just look and see from the Japanese Empire 1874 to 1895, or what it was here. This is Japan originally, and then you can see the Korea, and then Manchuria. It's a Japanese sphere of influence, but they actually officially took it over in the 1930s. Very, very resource-rich place, Manchuria. When I lived in China, I actually lived in what they call Dalian, which is right here at the end of Manchuria. It's a very nice place.
Me and Mama lived in Shanghai when I went there.
Yeah, when we lived, when I
went there in 2017.
yeah, when I lived in 2017, we lived in Shanghai, but I actually lived there in college. When I was probably your age, from when I was 19 to when I was 20, I spent a year studying abroad in China, and I lived in Dalian, so I lived here. So, but anyway, you can see the arrows. You can just look at this map and see. This just gives you a map idea. I think there might be a map in Marks. I think this is a little bit of a better map that I wanted to show you. So after World War I, Japan becomes a major economic power. As I said before, they're the only country to throw off the unequal treaties and have equal treaties with the West. The only country who had unequal treaties to throw them off at this time. So they become a major force and a strong modern country here. So the 1920s, Japan was prosperous. They expanded with civil society and democracy. Dower makes this point, and I actually have one of the quiz questions about Dower. Was like and it's something I pointed out that he talks about how that basically that one of his big points when we talk about the occupation is that Japan already had experience with democracy. So in the 1920s they did, and even in the 1910s they did experience. He says that he puts experience with civil society. They weren't a democracy in the same way the United States was, but they did have experience with democracy and with civil society. So I always say I'll give you the answer to one quiz question, and I'm giving you an answer here. John Dower did say that, so the Dower question about Japan's experience with civil society, that would be true. And they had good relations, and they had very good relations with Western countries in the 20s. This is actually very important. Now, they were frustrated with global racial discrimination. They didn't dislike American immigration policy. In 1924, the United States had a new immigration policy where it made Japanese ineligible to become citizens and basically stopped Japanese immigration. That was a very bitter thing in Japan. It didn't ruin the relationship, but it strained the relationship between the United States and Japan. But as I said, they also embraced ideas of whiteness being superior, and they saw themselves as whiter. And when Japanese drew themselves during this time, even though actually Japanese have a wide range of skin colors, just like Chinese do, they would always draw the Japanese as lighter than the other Asian countries. I'll show you an example of that momentarily.
Oh, I don't get drawing.
So the Great Depression really hit Japan hard. One thing that happened in the Great Depression is everybody, to protect their own industries, put up tariffs. The tariff is something where you tax coming in, and they thought, okay, this will help put our own workers to work. Unfortunately, it was actually a disastrous economic decision. It seemed like it would be someone, okay, well, yeah, we won't export from anything else. We want to make sure our own workers can have jobs. But in fact, it actually completely hurt trade. So it because everybody retaliated, and then trade was destroyed. Global trade was destroyed, and that actually very much deepened the depression, made it so much worse. So that's why people say now tariffs are not a good way to help your economy when things get rough, because then global trade will stop, and that will stop a lot of work, a lot of jobs. And this happened in the Great Depression. It really hit Japan hard though, because Japan exported a lot of their silk stuff, especially silk stockings, and so Japan was really hit hard by this. They started questioning the value of democracy. They started thinking, especially since at the same time. And I'm leaving you to read this in the book because I can't lecture about everything. But the Nazis at first seemed like, especially if you didn't care that much about the anti-Semitism and the fact that people who are Jewish were losing their jobs, if you could somehow get, quote unquote, get past that, you could look and see that Germany under fascism was actually getting out of the Depression a lot faster than the United States and the democratic countries. So fascism started to becoming interesting to Japanese, and also there was more and more anti-Western feeling, more dissatisfaction with rural poverty. Japan grew and became very modern, but that was more in the cities. There was a lot of poverty in the rural areas, and that became more and more something that people were more and more sensitive to. That in itself wasn't a bad thing necessarily, but it was combined with the fascism that people would find this more problematic. Germany seemed to be an attractive model, and Germany was becoming prosperous through taking over Poland, through basically their imperialism, and so the idea of prosperity through imperialism became very attractive. They took over Manchuria. So, and that's another from Marx. Marx goes into this. That's another. I'll give you one more quiz question. It's another true/false question about Japan. Taking over Manchuria in the 1930s. and the economic problems they were having. That is true. That is another true. So I'm giving you 2 quiz questions now. So more ideas of Japanese racial superiority. One thing, though, I have to emphasize is that there are many different voices in Japanese government. So a lot of times when people talk about the Japanese in World War II, they talk about it somehow it's like one big group. But there were the war hawks, and Tojo Hideki was like one of the main war people who were really pro-war. But there were a lot of people, because remember, all through missionaries came to Japan as they were open to the late 19th century. There were a lot of missionaries, and you guys won't know, but Mira Noriko, this is what Noriko studies. We have a very good Japanese friend who Noriko. Mira loves Noriko. We stayed at her house when we went to Japan. And she studies. I study missionaries in China. She studies missionaries in Japan, American missionaries in Japan. And so she really looks at the bonds. So there was a lot of bonds with Japan and the United States through the 1920s. And there were a lot of people in Japan who, even when Japan as a rule became more anti-foreign, and then at the same time the United States was becoming more anti-Japanese, that was very painful for a lot of people who had a lot of ties, like both Americans who had strong ties to Japan and Japanese who had strong ties to Americans. They were kind of caught in the middle here in some ways. And those voices were still there. There was definitely a peace party who wanted peace, who did not want Japan to become imperialist. So there wasn't just like one Japanese voice here, and you really need to, it's very, very important that you understand that. So again, this wasn't all Japanese, but there became an idea that was more and more prominent in the Japanese government called Asia for Asians. And this was the idea that they would throw out all the Westerners and Europeans, and the Japanese would rule Asia, and it would be better for Asians. However, it was really Asia for the Japanese. It was the Japanese were the people who ruled who ruled Japan, and it was just like the India's economy was basically kind of warped, and a lot of African colonies were warped to benefit Britain and France. These other Asian economies were kind of warped to benefit the Japanese the same way. So there's a lot of hypocrisy in this idea, the Japanese saying, okay, we're going to throw off Western imperialism and we're going to be better imperialists. Most Asian countries did not experience them as being better imperialists. So 1937, Japan began the Second Sino-Japanese War. That's World War II. That was the beginning of World War II, actually. We think of it more as 1941, but this was 1937 was the beginning. Now, I told you I was going to talk more about this idea of the white skin. So this is the Japanese representation of what they call the East Asian co-prosperity sphere, and that's something that Marx mentions as well. The idea was that the Japanese would take over these other countries, and then there would be co-prosperity. They would all work together, and those bad Western imperials would be gone, and the Japanese would take over. However, it was, as I said, really, really more to benefit the Japanese. Now, this is a really interesting picture.
Is it on the
Well, you recognize what's on the man's the flag? Do you recognize what this is?
Yeah, it's Japanese flag.
It's the Japanese flag. So you see the Japanese flag. And so this is Japan, and you notice they make, even though, again, this isn't true, but they make the Japanese skin much, much whiter than the Indonesian skin. This is in Indonesia, when they took over Indonesia. This is the Dutch, because the Dutch were ruling Indonesia at the time. So this is a Dutch girl running away. This is showing the Dutch running away, kind of shown as in a cartoon. This isn't how the Dutch really dressed. They didn't really wear these huge clogs and, these this way, but it's sort of a stereotypical kind of Dutch look. The going away. This is the Japanese sun, saying that like coming over. And you can see the Japanese hand wearing a Western style suit. The idea that Indonesians were kind of uncivilized. You see them wearing this wearing this kind of traditional outfit and having no shirt and wearing a shovel. So
Not wearing a shovel.
Not wearing a shovel. I'm sorry, holding a shovel.
I have a cool hat.
Yeah. And so and looking grateful and happy. But even in this way, even in this most positive Japanese, you can see the idea that they would be the laborers. Now, in the East Asian co-prosperity sphere, the Japanese said the Japanese would be the head because they were the smartest in this idea. China would be the hands, and then Indonesia would be the feet. And so the Chinese would maybe do some bureaucracy and maybe some civil servants, because even though for years and for centuries and centuries, for most of human history, China had been more powerful. At this time, the Japanese had started to see themselves as superior to the Chinese. And then the Indonesians were actually the feet, and they would be the laborers. So you can see that that's why he's dressed up as the Indonesian representative is a laborer. There were Indonesians, of course, who wore suits, and certainly many, many Chinese who wore suits at this time. But this was the representation they were doing. This is in John Dower's book, by the way. We're going to read something by John Dower. So one really bad thing that happened was in this the it's called the Rape of Nanjing. 100,000 civilians were killed by Japanese soldiers. You guys can Google this if you want to. I'm not going to chat with you too much about it right now. But it was a really, really horrific thing. There's a whole book about it. And it was something that made a lot of headlines. And people wonder, like, how can, a lot of times, this is actually some books that people wrote after the war, like Japanese who were good brothers and sons, how could they have acted so horrific when they went overseas? And they really did act horrifically overseas, especially in World War II. The Japanese had a lot of really horrific atrocities. And one big answer to that question, actually, is these ideas about race. These ideas that somehow these were inferior people, but also because they weren't. And then the Chinese were actually, they had this idea because they were so superior that they could just march in and take everything. But the Chinese fought back really hard. And so a lot of people say that this was born out of frustration. The Japanese military at the time was very hierarchical, very abusive in many ways. And that was another thing that maybe led to this. So there's different reasons about this, but it's a horrific moment. It wasn't talked about it was actually talked about a lot when it happened for like years after, but then it kind of left historical knowledge, and then it came back when somebody wrote a book. It's an important moment, so you can Google this if you want to know more. Okay, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. This is interesting. I spend a few minutes on this in my lectures because it's gotten a lot of attention. I want to, or there's some different ideas, and I want to actually talk about them with you. So, our president at the time, Roosevelt, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, came and gave a Day of Infamy speech, and he said basically we were at peace with Japan. We didn't know this was going to happen at all, and then they attacked us out of the blue. What actually happened was Roosevelt did actually know that the Japanese were planning on attacking. It was not a completely out of the blue thing. He himself, so basically Japanese, as I said, is very resource poor. They got a lot of their oil from the United States. Even after the Rape of Nanjing, FDR did not want to cut off their oil because, and this is important, as I said, Japanese government was not monolithic. There were many different voices, and there was a peace party and a war party. So he said, if we cut off oil, then we're going to basically force the Japanese hand, and then the peace party won't have a leg to stand on, and the war party will take over, and they'll do this. Actually, one of his deputies, his name was Cordell Hull, actually, another administrative person, actually cut the oil off of Japan, because basically because it was so horrific. Because of the horrors that the Japanese were perpetuating. They said, we're not going to put our oil anymore. This, as everybody knew would happen, did force so then the Japan actually had a choice. They had 6 months worth of oil. They either had to completely give up their imperial ambitions, or they had to attack more, and they had to actually step up their attacks and actually become independent oil-wise. So they knew they were going to do it, but here's the idea. Is that there's this idea of the back door to war. And some people say because in fact, Roosevelt did know about that he actually wanted the Japanese to attack Pearl Harbor, and he actually let it happen. And the idea is because they wouldn't go to war in Europe, and so Roosevelt wanted to go to war, wanted to enter the war, and by sacrificing Pearl Harbor, which is in Hawaii, then he would be able to do this. Now, why that isn't right is because he actually didn't realize they were going to attack Pearl Harbor. It actually was a pretty amazing thing that he was able to attack, the Japanese were able to attack Pearl Harbor. It was really difficult to keep radio silence for that long. So it wasn't something you would guess. There was also a racial idea that the Japanese couldn't do that because of an inner ear issue that was just like most racial theories, stupid and not true. But there were a whole host of reasons why. They actually expected an attack on the Philippines. But that didn't sound as good for the speech to say, actually, we messed up. Our intelligence messed up. We thought they were going to attack the Philippines. Instead, they attacked the Hawaii. So he just said, yeah, we didn't know anything about it. We were at peace with them. This was a complete shock. But it's also not true that the Japanese wanted, that Roosevelt knew, or there's no evidence, no credible evidence that Roosevelt wanted, that Roosevelt actually wanted the Japanese or let the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. So I just kind of wanted to clear that up because that's something that you see kind of in late night conspiracy theories, that Roosevelt actually let this happen. Okay, so let's I'm going to show you, this is from John Dower's book, actually, the historian that you're reading, U.S. views of Japan and then Japanese views of the United States. So if you look at this, and you see that the U.S. tended to view Japan often as monkeys. So this is a small monkey, and they were kind of small monkeys sometimes. And then this idea: will the Japanese attack the U.S. and Britain, or will they attack Russia first? Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. So this was from July 1941. This is before Pearl Harbor. Now this is a really interesting picture here. If you look at this one, so you see that the idea, a popular idea in the United States of Japanese is portraying them as monkeys, as not even human. That was supposed to be a Japanese, yeah. You see this, and the idea that the Japanese were mimicking Hitler. So you see Hitler is taking over different places in Europe, and then the Japanese are taking over different places in the Philippines. And one, there's this idea that they were, you still see Hitler as a human being, the Japanese were monkeys. But here's another really interesting thing. Mm-hmm. So they don't say Germans here, they say Hitler. And if you're saying Hitler is doing all these bad things, you can still imagine good Germans, right? Mm-hmm. But even though, remember I told you that there was like a peace party and a war party, there's a lot of different complicated people in Japan? They would allow for that in Germany, that there were good Germans, but there was in the American imagination at the time, there were no good Japanese. So they don't say Hideki, Tojo Hideki, or Tojo would be his last name. They don't say Tojo. They don't give one of the war leaders here, like they give Hitler here. They just say Japs. And this is the idea that all Japanese are somehow the same.
Yeah.
So it's something, again, very, very different perception of Hitler. There still could be good Germans, but with the Japanese at the time, there was becoming almost a perception of, and again, there were some Americans, just like there were Japanese who still had good feelings toward the United States, there were Americans who had good feelings toward Japan, but they weren't in the majority. This was when we talk about the popular perception. So that's a very revealing. Then after Harbor, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to skip that. Well, you can just go back. That's a picture of a really, really huge ape. And it showed how even that people started becoming more, because Pearl Harbor seemed almost a superhuman thing, and they started imagining the Japanese as being a really huge apes. We started seeing the pictures of them instead of being little monkeys, really big monkeys. Japanese view of U.S. and England. That's an interesting thing. So this is something that you see here. You see Churchill and FDR. And Churchill's really a badger, and then he's calling in, and badgers aren't well liked in Japan, so that was kind of criticism. And then there's sort of all the death. And here under Roosevelt, the idea that he's kind of a horse's ass, and so these are the Japanese kamikaze planes lifting them up, but also that all Roosevelt really cared about was money. And this actually led to a really fatal miscalculation. So Pearl Harbor, I don't know if you've heard of it. Mary, have you heard of Pearl Harbor? No. In 1941, the Japanese attacked Hawaii, and attacked a military base on Hawaii, and took out a lot of American ships. And that's actually why the Americans went into World War II. Yeah. And it's seen as a stupid thing because they when the Americans went into World War II, that really hurt the Japanese, because the Americans had, since they weren't being attacked themselves, this is the first kind of one of very few attacks on American soil, so they were drawn into it, whereas Japan might have been more successful if they weren't. And again, just as people had stereotypes about the Japanese and didn't understand, and that's actually one of the reasons why they didn't anticipate Pearl Harbor as much, the Japanese had stereotypes about the Americans that all they cared about was money, and they were soft, and then if they were actually threatened, they would just withdraw. And that's not what happened. And anybody who knew Americans would predict that. And there were many Japanese who knew Americans well enough who were actually saying would have said that was a bad idea. But this was this popular idea, and to some extent they believed their own hype. They believed their own stereotypes about Americans. Does that make sense? That doesn't make sense, but do you kind of understand that, Mira?
A little.
A little, yeah. So they believed kind of their own stereotypes about Americans, that they were soft and all they cared about was money, and that they wouldn't do anything to threaten. So if you threatened them on their own soil, they would just withdraw. But instead, of course, that actually was what made the United States become into World War II. This is kind of John Dower's idea that you both in his book, what's called War Without Mercy, that they both developed stereotypes about each other, and that those stereotypes actually hurt each of them in their war efforts. So Japanese Empire during World War II, it was again an empire with a lot of brutality that's remembered very, very badly by Korea and China and in Indonesia. There's a lot of brutality during World War II, during this. And it's something that the Japanese remember, with a lot of Japanese feel very ashamed about this too. It's not a good moment in Japan. In a way, the Japanese almost put too much on the war, because the Japanese as a population did go along with this. There was a lot of popular racism. Instead, now how they say it's like a bunch of war leaders led Japan into this. I'll talk more about that momentarily. But this is a picture of this. How huge this is. This is Manchukuo, which became, it was originally Manchuria. Japanese had a sphere of influence, but in 1931 they invaded this, and it became Manchukuo, which is like a Manchu country, which was a part of the Japanese country. You see the Dutch East Indies, Korea, and then China, Thailand. So you can see the huge. You can see basically what a large empire it was at its height. And then the attacks that they did. You can see the red arrow for Pearl Harbor and these things. So this is just a picture. You can just kind of look at this map to understand. Again, I think you have a map by mark, but I think this is a better map here that you can look at to understand that where everything is and the depth of the Japanese Empire. So, Japan actually had a lot of starvation, a lot of hunger. Not at the beginning, but toward the end of the war. A lot of Japanese citizens were completely sick of the war. And it ended, though, basically with first a bomb on Hiroshima and then on Nagasaki. People never thought that the West would attack Nagasaki because there were so many Christians in it. The reason they chose Hiroshima and Nagasaki was because Tokyo had already been destroyed, as Mark says, through firebombs. So like they wouldn't have been able to show the impact of it. They chose Hiroshima and Nagasaki because they were relatively untouched, so you could really see the damage. Hiroshima today. This is a picture. Mary, you want to see this picture? This building, of course, would naturally fall, but the people of Hiroshima wanted to be able to show the world what the impact of a nuclear bomb would be on a building. And this is actually, our nuclear bombs now are much more powerful. They wanted to show like how horrible it was. So this is actually, you can't go near it, you can't go into it. It's covered by a gate. But two of my friends in Japan and I went when I lived there, and when I taught there. I taught in Japan for a year. Right after I graduated from college, before I went to graduate school.
What's
and,
your friends you go to?
Lynn and Colleen. You do know them, that's right. But you've heard of them, yeah.
A lot.
Yeah, my friends Lynn and Colleen and I went there. Yeah, you've seen their pictures and stuff from my time in Japan.
Yeah.
And so this is so then there's like a gate around, like I kind of a gate around this, but this kind of shows what will happen. So this is a picture that I have from that. This is a much sadder picture. It's the permanent scars. Basically, in the center of the building, Japanese school had been abandoned, so the 7th graders were to give themselves something to do. Were actually supposed to be picking up trash in the center of the city when the bomb landed. It was really horrific. There are horrific stories about them. Literally, people's eyes falling out. These 12-year-olds' eyes falling out, and them trying to get home with their feet burned. It was really, really horrific, and it definitely brought home the meaning of what total war meant. Now, there are 3 different views of this that are worth thinking about. One is the popular U.S. view, and there's a popular view that this was justified because the Japanese would never ever surrender. And this was just because, and then there's this kind of a weird cultural thing going on there, like, oh, they're the samurai culture, and they would fight to the death, every last one of them. No. That's actually just completely ridiculous. A lot of the Japanese were looking for ways to surrender, and there was no unified Japan. People were hungry, people were starving at the time, and again, there'd always been a peace party in there already, so it wasn't like every single Japanese would have fought. So there are academic debates in the United States about Hiroshima. Most people say, And and Americans knew that Americans and Eisenhower, who was the head, had said there was no need to use that awful thing on them. They were ready to surrender. So even a lot of American military people have said that. They didn't want to surrender unconditionally. They wanted the idea of the emperor being a deity, but even that there was more negotiating room on there. So a lot of in the United States, a lot of academics would say it was really more to show. It was sort of the first in this it was a convenient way to show the Soviet Union, to kind of get the superiority of the Soviet Union. But the Japanese view is actually interesting, and the Japanese, to some extent, more than American academics, actually say that Hiroshima and Nagasaki, even though there were horrific things, and they actually understand how horrific they were, the Japanese understand, of course, that the idea of that all the Japanese were ready to fight to the death was ridiculous at this point. Because they understand this. And in fact, they're almost too willing to say, oh, it was just a couple of like war leaders and the rest of the Japanese people were essentially peaceful. That's probably not completely true either. But certainly it wasn't true that all Japanese were willing to fight to the death. But what was true is that people like Tojo Hideki and the other war leaders knew that they would be basically tried and killed if peace came, and so they actually probably would have let many more Japanese die, and many more Americans, certainly many more Americans die in pursuit of trying to get a better deal. So the war leaders at the time were still trying to get a better deal for themselves, like trying to get themselves immunity, and they certainly would have actually fought harder to do that since they still had a lot of power, Tojo Hideki and the like. So it was more like there were some very selfish, and I wouldn't even say this was a Japanese view. This is something now that if you look at Syria, the government now who is willing to basically sacrifice it and have so much bloodshed just to keep their own power, or just to do this. And in fact, Tojo Hideki was in fact tried as a war criminal and executed after the war. So he was right that this was going to happen if the Japanese surrendered unconditionally. So and this is like the Japanese view. So what the Japanese view say is that as horrible as the nuclear war was, that they actually might have saved a lot of Japanese lives and made peace come more quickly and helped the Japanese country as a whole. Because they did, and most Japanese would say that the unconditional surrender was a good thing. Now, it's kind of an interesting thing about that. That's kind of an important debate. So you have here Japan as an ally after the Cold War, and this is an interesting picture. You can look at this picture and you can see that Japan is still a monkey, but it's sort of a cute little monkey. If you can look at this, yeah. And this is the idea. And even very soon the Japanese became very prosperous. So you had surprisingly quick return to good relations. And this is, one of the big things because I showed you the pictures before. There were such vicious pictures on both sides of each other. So how did they get along? Well, one thing you need to understand is the 1920s before. The fact that they were really, that in the 1920s and the 1910s, and really before that, Japan, even after the opening, in 1853, that Japan had pretty good relations with the United States and Britain. And so it was more of a return to what was before. They had already experimented with, democracy to some degree, so democracy wasn't new to them. They were fairly homogeneous, even though there was a lot of differences in Japan. There wasn't like a lot of strife between Japanese people as well. So Japan became the main ally in the Cold War, especially after 1949, when China became a communist country. Japan became even more important to the United States. Now, the article that you're going to read is by John Dower, again, the historian of Japan. And so fast forward to 2003, Japan has become a very successful country. As I said, it is one of the had the second biggest, in 2003, the second biggest economy in the world after the United States. So a very, very economically successful country. And the idea was that, okay, the occupation went so well, it was because it was a good occupation, that's what made Japan successful. And what John Dower says, and what a lot of people of Japan said, no, they were already a very successful country before that. So you have to, this is what's at stake, why this is so important to know. You have to look back to the 19th century and realize that not being a colony and other things, that Japan had already been a modern country. So it was really more getting back to where they were before. Getting Japan back to where they were before. Not that and so some people say, yeah, the United States came in, they swept in, and they made Japan this really successful country. No, they really didn't. It's really important to understand that it was. It's really important to understand that it wasn't America that made Japan successful. They already had those tools in place. It's true that Japan was an absolutely devastated country after World War II. But they had the tools, they had the technology, they understood how to rebuild themselves already. They had already been a modern country. Whereas Iraq, one, had not had that experience, had no experience with democracy. And also, there was a lot of what they call sectarian divisions, a lot of fighting within. We're going to learn more about that next week. But that's something that's also very different. So that's something that you'll read about with John Dower. But again, when you talk about Japan becoming the most successful, the second biggest economy in the world, now they're the third behind China. We'll talk more about that later in the. But for many years they were the second. Such an incredibly economic success. It's not that the United States swooped in and made this happen. You need to look back to the 19th century. That's very important. Okay, so if there's anything you're not confused about, feel free to email me. I can go over it on Friday in our discussion group, or just email you back. Anyway, it's been a long lecture, 50 minutes, but there's a lot to go over with Japan, and we've done a pretty long time span. So I'll see you guys later. Thanks. Bye.